Here we are. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the concept of the pink tide. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that concept. It's a metaphor, and it captures the idea that in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's been a class conflict between the progressive forces and the reactionary forces, and that class conflict goes back and forth. It's like a tide. And the pink too is appropriate too, because it's not so much a tide which, particularly now, that is explicitly socialist. It's more like a social democratic tide. So it's pink, but not quite red. Anyway, if we look at the flow of history, let's go back to 1977, when the region was dominated by US-backed military dictatorship. So if you remember, that was the period of Operation Condor, a US plot, very sad period. And so almost all of South America was dominated by these really repressive right-wing military dictatorships, all but Colombia and Venezuela in South America. Then if we move a little bit further into the present, remember in 1998, a Venezuelan, Hugo Chavez, ran for the presidency and won. And that kind of ushered in the second wave of the pink tide. And so we see that by 2008, almost the entire region was pink. This is the graphics are from the web, and you'll notice that this particular graphic that I ended up using has Cuba colored as a dictatorship. That is not my view at all, but it was the best graphic I could find. So excuse me for that. So anyway, the pink tide of 2008, that then there was a right-wing reaction, conservative backlash. And by 2018, particularly with the election of Mauricio Macri in far right, well, not far right, but a solid rightist in Argentina, the tide started to ebb in the direction of conservatism. And most of the continent got into the blue column. Then if we sort of forward to last year, we saw there was kind of a balance there. There was some progressive governments and some fairly right of center governments. But then two really important events came about last year. Two places where there was major left victories. That was in Colombia and then in Brazil. So that brings us up to the present. And so, but let me recap sort of the flow of history, because this latest surge of the pink tide, I would sort of say, started in around July of 2018 with the election of Andre Manuel Lopez Obrador. He goes by the acronym AMLO. Probably most of you are familiar with AMLO. And he had founded a new political party in Mexico, the Morena Party. And in July of that year, 2018, Morena absolutely swept the elections, the local elections, the state elections, and the national elections. Very important because this was the first time in 36 years that someone who was not a neoliberal took over the government. And I have a lot of affection for Mexico, and I feel that a lot of people, even on the left, don't give it its due, because it's a very important country. It is internationally the 13th largest world economy, larger than a number of European economies, by the way. In Latin America and the Caribbean, it's the second largest economy. And for the United States in particular, it's the United States' second greatest trade partner, bookended by Canada, which is the leading trade partner of the US, and China, which is the third trade partner of the US. Then, about a year later, in October 2019, the Fernandezes won the election in Argentina and kicked out the neoliberal Mauricio Macri. The Fernandezes are not related at all, but Cristina Fernandez previously had been president of Argentina in the period 2003 to 2007, and she goes by the initials CFK. Then, 3 weeks after the Argentine election tragedy hit, there was a coup that ousted Evo Morales in Bolivia. Evo Morales, as you probably know, was the first indigenous president of a largely indigenous country. This was a coup that was backed by the Organization of American States, and the OAS, by definition, is backed by the United States. That's what it's about. However, practically a year from the date of the initial coup, there was a popular election, and Luis Arce won. He won by a landslide, vindicating that the party of Evo Morales, the MAS party, the Party for the Movement Towards Socialism, was indeed the people's choice. And Evo Morales was able to come back from exile back to his home country. Then in Peru, in June of 2021, Pedro Castillo won the presidential runoff election against Keiko Fujimori. Keiko is the daughter of the Alberto Fujimori. Alberto Fujimori is right now in prison for human rights abuses. He was a previous president of Peru. But Pedro Castillo himself was a complete unknown. In the first round of the presidential elections, in the international press, he came in second. Maybe, no, I'm sorry, in the popular vote, I think he actually had a plurality of the popular vote. And then he would be one of the two candidates in the runoff. The international press did not even have a photograph of this man because he was such a grassroots leader. He was a leader of a teacher strike, and a very poor person, a peasant person, a person that had very humble origins. And he won against Keiko Fujimori just by a razor-thin margin. Did not have much of a mandate behind him in terms of popular vote, and he inherited a legislature which was dominated by the extreme right wing, and a legislature which is extremely class and ethnically stratified. So a person like him from a humble background just never ever got a chance ever to govern. And the second he came into the office, he had his feet to the fire. But we'll go into that a little bit more in this talk. Also, good news was Nicaragua, and I think a number of you are familiar with Nicaragua, quite familiar, probably more so than I am. And so you probably lived through or knew about the April 2018 attempt of a coup in Venezuela, a coup which, as in just about every other coup in the hemisphere, has the mark of Washington behind it. The Sandinista government survived that coup, and then in November of 2021, Daniel Ortega was reelected president and was very successful reaffirmation of the Sandinista mandate, which was again reaffirmed in November of last year when the Sandinistas swept the municipal elections. Also in November 2021, there were elections for regional and legislative elections in Venezuela. And the PSUV, which is the Socialist Party, is the governing party in Venezuela, won that with a big sweep, renewing their mandate. And it was significant that their mandate was renewed because the country was and is under punishing US sanctions, and the people still supported the government in the majority. More recently, the illegitimate president of Venezuela, probably some of you know the story, it's an interesting story, and perhaps in the Q&A we could go into it in more detail, but in January of 2019, Mike Pence, the then U.S. vice president, called up this guy, Juan Guaido, and said, how would you like to become president of Venezuela? Juan Guaido had just become the head of the unicameral assembly in Venezuela by rotation, not by election, but by rotation. And so Juan Guaido said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And the next day, Juan Guaido went on the street corner in Venezuela and said, hey, I'm the legitimate president. And Mr. Trump called him up and said, that's great, I'll recognize you. And a number of the United States' most sycophantic allies also recognized Juan Guaido, a person which at that point, 81% of the Venezuelan population by a poll had never even heard of this guy's name. So the guy that the US recognized as president of Venezuela was somebody that was not only never ran for national office, but nobody even knew of him, completely unknown, which made him a perfect puppet for the US. But most recently, the end of December of this year, even his own right-wing coalition gave him the boot. And so Venezuelans, independent, legitimate aspirations are looking rosier than ever, from some low points, and especially with the reestablishment of relationships with Colombia. And I'll get to that in a moment. Then probably one of the sweetest victories, and I don't know if your speaker last month, Karen Springs, talked about it, but I would imagine she did. Xiomara Castro won in Honduras. And Miss Castro is the wife of Mel Zelaya, who was deposed in a coup in 2009, a coup that was engineered by the Obama White House and led by Hillary Clinton. And so it was just a beautiful thing for everybody who had followed Honduras for all these years to see that reversal. Honduras, as you probably know, during the dirty wars of the 1980s and 1990s, where the U.S. supported the various right-wing groups like the Contras in Nicaragua. Honduras had gained the reputation of being the USS Honduras. That is the idea that it was the battleship, the aircraft carrier that the United States used to attack the other countries. So now we have a genuine left of center leader in there. And many of us on the left had accused the previous government, that was supported strongly by the United States, as a narco dictatorship. And in fact, very soon after Ms. Castro won the election, the United States extradited the previous president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, for drug charges. And he is now in prison for massive drug trafficking to the United States. This is the person that the United States has supported to the hilt. And then just a little bit over 2 weeks after Xiomara wins the presidency, there's another left of center victory in Chile. A man by the name of Gabriel Boric wins. And Gabriel Boric had been a student leader. He came out of the massive protests in Chile in the period 2019, 2020. And these protests were indeed massive. Just an amazing number of people in Chile were mobilized on the streets. And he rode that to victory. But then last year, we had two really extremely important sea change victories for progressive forces. First came in Colombia. Now, Colombia is a country where a previous president said, I am proud to be considered the Israel of Latin America. And the inference was that Israel is sort of a US surrogate in the Middle East. And he would say, I'm just proud to be a US surrogate in the in the Latin American region. And in fact, that is precisely the role that Colombia played in the region. But that changed on June 19th, 2022, when Gustavo Petro won the election. A former guerrilla, leftist guerrilla, since then moved much more to the center, but still the first left-leaning president in the entire history, 200 years of Colombian history. And his running mate, Francia Marquez, is an Afro-descendant person, and he comes out of the environmental movement and a true grassroots leader. And they won. And they won without being assassinated, because other leftists have run for the presidency in Colombia, but never lived to an election day, let alone to win to take presidential office. Again, we see they were brought in by a tidal wave of protests in the period 2019, 2020. And I think, and the group that they were with was called the Pacto Histórico. And what we see here is a tendency with this whole wave of pink tide victories, is that these were indeed what you might call a rebellion and rejection of the neoliberal model. That the neoliberal model had shown the people of the region that it did not serve their interests, did not serve their material interests, and they were going to kick out the previous conservative governments. One of the things that Petro ran on was reopening relations with Venezuela in defiance of the United States, but in friendship between two sisterly people. And he also ran on the platform of creating peace in a country where it was very, very violent paramilitary and guerrilla activities and government reactions to them, had a very, very high level of displaced people. And he ran on a peace platform to in fact, honor the 2016 peace accords, which had been dishonored by Uribe, and by the most recent president before him, Ivan Duque. And those peace negotiations continue to this day, and they're showing them results. They're showing some results. Just this week, new statistics have come out on Colombia, and the death rate is going down, and there's a lot of good things coming out of Colombia right now. But probably the most important left victory was in October of last year. One that was felt around the world. This was a significant left victory, because Brazil is the largest economy in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's the 8th largest economy in the world. BRICS, Brazil is a member of the coalition of BRICS countries. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America, in South Africa. And BRICS is expanding. Soon to join them is Argentina, and then possibly Iran, even Indonesia, Saudi Arabia. A number of other countries are in the process of either joining BRICS or getting affiliated with it. And Lula, from the very beginning, was a leader in international diplomacy against global warming and for regional integration and for independence. This, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with Lula, but I'll just go into some of his background, because it's a wonderful success story. He was born to a very poor and humble background. He was a shoeshine boy as a child. He became a machinist and eventually formed the Machinist Union and used that as a base for developing the Workers' Party. And that party eventually took the presidency of Brazil, and he was president for 2 very successful terms, one of the most popular politicians in all of Brazil after he left the presidency. Fast forward a little bit to 2018, Brazil is now having an a presidential election. And where is Lula? Lula is in jail, a victim of lawfare that the United States colluded with to put Lula in jail so that he could not run in the 2018 election, even though he was the most popular by far politician in all Brazil. The person who won was an army captain, Bolsonaro, a extreme right-winger, and we'll get to that in a moment of what's happened since then. But of course, we've all heard about the coup or attempted coup in Brazil last month. So, in addition to the actors that I've mentioned within Latin America and Caribbean, we see also the emergence of China as a major actor in the hemisphere. And China first started being involved in the hemisphere back in 2000, back in the year 2000. And at that point, its involvement in terms of particularly trade was very, very minor. But then the involvement of China in trade in the region just has increased exponentially. A complete exponential trade and involvement in the region. And now that China is involved in the region, it provides the region with more diverse commercial and financial options. They're no longer stuck with the Yankees. China has an economic initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative, and now over 20 Latin American and Caribbean countries have signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative. Right now, China is the leading trade partner in South America and second only to the United States in the entire Latin American and Caribbean region. And China is not only expanding its economic influence, but also diplomatic, cultural, and even military presence in the hemisphere. This was particularly important during the COVID pandemic, when China supplied the region with medical equipment, loans, and hundreds of millions of vaccine doses when the other Western countries failed to do that. The China's rival and what the Chinese view, correctly in my opinion, part of China, Taiwan, is further isolated in the region. And the role of China has actually been, I think, life support for the states of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And I would add that other countries, particularly Russia and Iran, have been very helpful to those states. I'll use the term socialist states as kind of a shorthand. It might be a little bit more technically correct to be calling them states that are striving for socialism. But those are the states that are targeted for US regime change. And if it weren't for China, Russia, and Iran, probably those states would not be around today. So we see a region that has been continually dominated by the US, the hegemon to the north. We're now in the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, and that doctrine seems to be still alive and well, unfortunately. And the new pink wave, the new pink tide, rather, they're faced with a paradox because they came into power because of problems that were created by the neoliberal conservative regimes prior to them. But once in power, they inherited those problems that they were running against. And now it's their task is to solve those problems. And the economic international milieu is not as favorable as it was in the previous pink wave of a pink tide of 2008. So let's go into that a little bit more in detail, just briefly. The U.S. has interfered, it sometimes interferes directly, but a lot of the U.S. interference is economic and is not as overt. What happened in the last decade, up until about 2021, is that there was a period of low interest rates. And as a result, a lot of developing countries in the region took on fairly high levels of debt during the last decade. Then the COVID pandemic hit, and these countries were all forced just about universally to go into greater debt to meet the COVID pandemic crisis. Now, interest rates are rising. And so these countries have very high debt rates, but they have to pay them back at inflated prices. And this has been particularly exacerbated, the inflation, which is now a global phenomenon, by the US imposed sanctions on Russia, imposed by the United States, I should say, and its allies. So we have the problem of higher debt. So we have higher debt by many countries in Latin America and Caribbean, and that has resulted in capital flight from those countries, especially to US financial markets. In the last month alone, the value of the US dollar as an international currency increased to 22% against the Japanese yen and 13% against the euro. And this increase in the value of the dollar in international markets further complicates the situation of the national economies for developing countries in the region. In short, the US domination of the world financial order drastically limits the possibilities of the majority of these countries to develop their economies successfully. So let's go into what's happened in the last few months, because we've had some setbacks, what I call the winter coup season in Latin America. And the first I should mention is the ongoing coups against the countries striving for socialism, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and to a certain extent, Bolivia. This particular illustration is a picture from the destabilization campaign against Bolivia in the province of Santa Cruz, which is in more of a right-wing area and opposed to the leftist central government. And Bolivian situation is not at the point of an active coup, but it is a sort of a long smoldering one. And I'll leave it there. But I would comment that when we look at this current wave of the pink tide, there was no new revolutions in Latin America and the Caribbean, nor were there any new revolutions currently on the horizon. And then for the existing socialist countries, that is Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, they are right now engaged in defensive struggles of regime change campaigns by the United States. So they're all in effect, in a certain level, in retreat. That might be too stark a way of putting it, but certainly they're on the defensive, and they are hurting and being hurt very much by US sanctions and other means to overthrow them. And their futures are probably more constrained than they ever were, and their survival is by no means guaranteed, particularly the ability to the US to enforce its sanctions have increased greatly in the last few years, and their ability to create tremendous hardship, particularly in Venezuela and Cuba, has been extreme. And maybe we can chat about that more. But some of the actual coups was that there was a lawfare coup against Cristina Fernandez, CFK in Argentina. She had survived an assassination attempt. If any of you had seen that horrible YouTube video where the assassin or would-be assassin shot a pistol point blank into her face. Fortunately, the pistol jammed and she didn't get killed. But then on December 6th, there was a lawfare coup by the right wing against her. She was sentenced to 6 years in jail. She's appealing that, so she's still free. And she was also barred from running for public office. She was the leading left candidate for the election that would be taking place in October of this year. So the prospects for the left are not good right now in Argentina. The right wing is gaining popularity precisely because of the problems that the progressive group government of CFK had inherited from Macri, who had put the country into tremendous debt. But then the Fernandezes inherited that tremendous debt. And now it looks like Macri might be running again in October of this year to come back into the presidency in Argentina. So that was on December 6th. Then the following day, there was a parliamentary and military coup against Pedro Castillo. The ever mercurial Peru has had now 6 presidents in 6 years. Mr. Castillo had never had a chance to govern. The right-wing legislature was on his case continually. They forced him through 6 cabinets, 3 impeachment attempts. The 3rd impeachment attempt was successful. A number of legal suits against him for corruption. His vice president was then made the de facto president of Peru, Dina Boluarte. And there have been massive demonstrations of people, the underclass, people who felt that Pedro Castillo was one of them, indigenous, poor people, campesinos. I have here in that bullet point mass demonstrations with over 60 people killed. I think that number may have even gone up to 70 killed right now. And I just I just did this a few days ago. So it's a very volatile situation. The country is really up in arms. The leftist presidents in the region have condemned the coup, and the popular movement is demanding that the de facto president, Diana Boluarte, step down. They want the Congress dissolved. They want a constituent assembly called, and they want Castillo freed, and they want new presidential elections. Then the there was a coup then in January of this year, and on the 8th of January, an unsuccessful coup by the followers of Bolsonaro against the democratically elected president of Brazil, Lula. That coup was unsuccessful. I'm sure most of you have followed that closely in the press, so I don't really need to go into it in any great detail, though maybe some of you might want to talk about it in the Q&A. But I did want to mention another hotspot, another flashpoint in the region, and that is Haiti. Haiti was a very proud and wonderful country. In 1804, Haiti had the first successful revolution in all of the region. It was a slave revolt that successfully overthrew the French colonial government. But ever since then, Haiti has been under the thumb of Western imperialism, particularly France and the United States, which has forced it to pay debts in part for freeing slaves. And probably there is no country in the hemisphere where the United States fingerprints are greater than Haiti. The United States probably has had the most influence in Haiti, but I think it is also the poster child of what it's like to see when the United States has the most influence. So today, Haiti is the poorest country in the hemisphere. It does not have an elected president. The last of the elected legislators have actually physically left the country. Government services are pretty non-existent. Gangs run rampant. Disease, cholera is once again rampant in the country. And the populace has risen up, rightly so. This is what the alternative to neoliberalism is. So it's when you see countries who overthrow neoliberalism, and excuse me, what I mean by the alternative is the alternative that the United States gives countries. It's like, if you don't accept the neoliberal model, this is what will rain upon you. So let me end with a few summary remarks, and then we can open up the discussion. So one of the points is to say that the most of these new pink tide governments, what we call social democratic governments, and being social democratic governments, they're looking for a partnership between the owning class and the working class, and in some ways that limits their ability to achieve far-reaching social change. And I think the example of a country that is not social democratic, and one that I think a number of you are very familiar with, is Nicaragua, and where you see in Nicaragua how much was achieved with so little. But that could not be achieved under a neoliberal form of government or a social democratic form of government. The overarching theme, of course, is the presence of the hegemon to the north, the presence of the United States. And Washington has, if anything, has become more aggressive in asserting its dominance. And it's particularly the case now that the Democratic Party, at least in my opinion, has become the leading party of war. And that's a new development. There's also the international recession that's gathering over the world, and that is hurting all the economies and making the achievement of the social programs of all these new all these new countries more and more difficult. And then when we look back at the previous surge of the pink tide in 2008, we see then there was a commodity boom where a lot of countries were able to ride the commodity boom, particularly Chavez's Venezuela and Lula's Brazil. Today, they don't have that commodity boom buoying up their economies. So there's a lot of challenges for the area. And I wanted to just end here with two notes about country that about Ecuador. This is a sad note, but I'm going to end with a happy note. This chart I just got from Joe Emmensberger, a Ecuadorian Canadian, sent it to me. I don't know if has ever been one of your speakers. He just wrote a book on Venezuela. I would highly recommend him as a Rockwood speaker. But this chart shows homicide rates from the beginning of this century, year 2000, to the present, and you see that this trend of increasing homicide rates in Ecuador, and then all of a sudden, it precipitously drops, and that corresponds to the election of Rafael Correa and the Citizens' Revolution. That's the difference between neoliberalism and its alternative on the left. And then after Correa had it was in office for 2 terms, he left office, and a man named Lenin Moreno took over and reimposed neoliberal forms. And now we see a steady increase in the homicide rate in Ecuador. I think this, in one graph, kind of gives you an idea of what the stakes are, what the neoliberal alternative looks like, and what is the progressive alternative that is different from the neoliberal alternative. The happy note, and I promise to end in a happy note, is that last Sunday there was an election, a local election throughout Ecuador, and Rafael Correa's Citizens' Revolution swept the election. And they did it because They were in coalition with Pachakutik, which is the indigenous party, and the sitting right-wing president Guillermo Lasso, who had put on a referendum on a constitutional change. His candidates lost big time, and the referendum lost as well. So that was a great thing to happen, and it will be a new day in Ecuador, I would hope. This particular gentleman, Omar Menendez, was just elected in that election as the mayor of Puerto Lopez, one of the cities in Ecuador. Unfortunately, there was a big cost because Menendez was assassinated the day before the election. Just the same, and he was a leftist, but just the same, the people, even though he was assassinated, elected him as their mayor in defiance of the right-wing violence. And with that, thank you very much for letting me share some of my thoughts, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing yours.